This time on Poll Hub, we're chatting with conservative commentator Jonah Goldberg about the Republican Party. Or maybe it should just now be called the Trump Party. We're going to talk about that. Polling has shown pretty significant shifts in who identifies as Republican. Are these changes permanent? And then Steve Thoma, executive director of the White House Correspondents Association, joins to discuss the relationship between the media and the White House. Interesting stuff, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Marigoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
So let's start today with Jonah Goldberg. Now, you wear a lot of hats, so I'm not going to try and go through all the things you're doing, but let me say that the Dispatch is new.
Yes.
So we'll talk about that. The Remnant podcast is something that a lot of people listen to. And if you follow Jonah on Twitter, you know about Zoe and Pippa.
Yes.
Your dogs. Because that's what you tweet about, perhaps more than anything else?
Well, particularly in these times where politics is so tribal, I find that dogs, and to a lesser extent cats, are they're not even just nonpartisan, they're transpartisan.
Transpartisan.
And
it's a good word.
As I'm launching a new media venture, I figured I shouldn't just constantly piss off some large segment of people that I want to subscribe to the thing. So, and I've been so crazy busy that I rely on a lot of dog tweets. And I will defend dog tweets. I would lose about a third of my followers, I think, if I stopped tweeting the dogs.
I have to say that it is one of the things that I most look forward to in the mornings. Not that I don't like the G-File, which is your email Friday, right?
These days it's still Friday.
Fridays, and the Dispatch is Mondays. Anyway, I do like the dogs. We're not here to talk about dogs, unfortunately, because that would be transpartisan and entertaining. What I wanted to ask you about, we talk a lot about polls, obviously, on Poll Hub here, and the thing we talk about an awful lot has been the transformation of the Republican Party. We've been polling for 40 years here, so we have a lot of data. And the party has become less urban, less suburban, less educated or educational attainment, whatever you want to call it. One of the things I wonder, from your perspective, having gone from the kind of the heart of the conservative movement to, as you described yourself a couple seconds ago, as a pariah right now, because
in certain quarters,
because of your views on Trump, is this transformation of the Republican Party into the Trump Party, if you will, do you think this is a permanent or long-lasting thing, or is this a flash in the pan?
I think the jury is out. I mean, it's probably apocryphal, but there's this story about how Chow En-lai was asked, he was a premier of China in the 1970s, whether he thought the French Revolution was a success. And he said, allegedly, too soon to tell. And so it's first of all, it's really
That's
worth
the long view of history.
That's right.
There.
That's right. It's really worth pointing out that while I would argue Trump has made a lot of the problems with the Republican Party worse, and a lot of problems with the country worse, he created very few of those problems. These things took a long time in developing. He accelerated some of them. He made some of them even more acidic. But the old core of the FDR coalition, the working class white guy, the Democratic Party has been hemorrhaging those voters for a very long time.
Since Reagan or before?
Even before, you could argue. And you look at the Nixon coalition. Nixon got a lot of Teamsters, but there were just so many of them that it was still sort of the heart of the Democratic Party, even when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. That has accelerated rapidly. I think Obama had a lot to do with accelerating that. I think a lot of changes in the economy had to do with accelerating that. It is what social scientists would call an overdetermined phenomena. You can come up with a lot of explanations for it, but Trump has made it worse. And one of the things I thought was so idiotic of a lot of the GOP was to rationalize the fact that Trump was winning over a lot of the non-college educated white working class to the point, which is great to have him on board. That's great. Republicans have been trying to win over that vote for a long time, but not at the expense of losing the suburban vote. The suburban vote in many ways really is, in some cases it's the base, in other cases it was the majority maker constituency for the Republican parties, like married couples, college educated, trying to figure out how to pay for their kids to go to college. And they have Trump has so alienated that constituency, which basically makes the party even Trumpier, because as we saw in 2018, we saw it to some extent in 2016. Anywhere where the Trump base didn't support a candidate, or anywhere where you couldn't get the suburban vote, those Republicans lost. And that's why we're watching Texas's transformation to blue accelerate. People have been talking about it for a very long time. Trump is accelerating the process. And so one of the things I think the Republican Party just made an enormous mistake about, and there are many things, is not imposing more discipline on Trump. You know, Trump campaigned on that Federalist Society list of judges because it was explained to him he had to. He became pro-life, which he wasn't for most of his career. He became a Republican. He supported the Second Amendment, all because it was explained to him he had to do those things to win Republican votes. And then people were like, well, we got him to agree to those things. Let's let him do anything else he wants. And I think that was a huge mistake.
So it's interesting you raised three issues, or two issues in particular, which is abortion, which is really what the judges is about, and guns. On so many other things that I think we used to think of as the heart of the Republican Party or conservatism, which was free trade and a big foreign policy of America, maybe not as the world's policeman, but certainly as a leader of
Sure.
values-based foreign policy. Boom, gone.
That's gone. That's gone, or at least it's in remission. One of the most interesting disconnects in political life, if you live in Washington, is to compare and contrast, as you professor types say, what Republican senators and congressmen say when the cameras and microphones are off versus when they're on. And there are a lot of people who honestly believe that we can just flip, or I don't want to speak like I'm speaking for the Republican Party,
right.
that the Republican Party can just flip back to the old Reaganite model once Trump is gone. I don't think that's going to be nearly as easy as they think.
Is that the Pete Wilson lesson from California? Or is that specific to California and a certain population?
I think in some ways that was sort of specific to California. I just sort of mean that they've chased away a lot of people. A lot of people have lost their credibility. You can't. And the other issue that you've left out, which I think is hugely important culturally, although it's not an obvious political thing, is the Republicans used to also stand for the importance of character, and they now are a lot of people in talk radio, a lot of people in sort of right-wing ink are locked into the idea that personal character doesn't matter, or even worse and more depressing, in ways that make me want to search Amazon for deals on hemlock. They have redefined what it means to be of good character to fit Donald Trump's character. And that is a really hard thing to walk back from or to unwind later. So I think it's going to be a mess for a while. I also think the Democratic Party is kind of losing its mind and making huge mistakes.
Well, both parties. I mean, part of that is the loss of faith in institutions.
Right.
In talking about Stanley Greenberg wrote a column recently, or an article, the Republican Party is doomed. Mm-hmm. Well, the Democratic Party's doomed too. The parties are doomed if you look at it in the light that we are in right now, which is there's no faith in institutions. Younger voters have no interest in joining a party. They may vote Democratic or Republican, but they don't want to join that club because it's a sour, it's a bad taste for them. But where does conservatism? One of the things you're doing in starting the Dispatch, you and Stephen Hayes and
David French,
is to kind of set. Well, you should tell me. It strikes me that what you're trying to do is set the table for a post-Trump conservative movement when Trump is gone and conservatives wake up and go, now what do we do?
Right.
Where do we go?
So that's exactly right. We don't consider ourselves. I mean, we all call ourselves Trump skeptics. To people who are all in for Trump and think under Comrade Trump we will have the greatest wheat harvests we've ever had. They just call us never Trumpers, but that's not how we define ourselves. Yeah. And we don't see this thing as being an anti-Trump thing. We see it as being a post-Trump thing. We're playing the long game, as it were. And so part of the overarching philosophical framework of why we're doing this ties into the stuff that we've been talking about. The weird paradox of the times that we live in is that there have been more polarized times in American history. 1850s were pretty polarized, 1930s, even the 1960s were more polarized. But we've never had a time where the polarization so completely mapped partisanship, and when the parties have been so unbelievably weak.
They couldn't do anything about it.
Right. And so the real story of the last 40 years is that both parties have voluntarily hollowed themselves out in terms of being functioning institutions. The primary system, the balkanization of media, the cable news, all of these things fed into it. But part of the result of that is that a lot of party functions have been outsourced to outside institutions, both in the mainstream media, in left of center media, and on the right wing media.
And not just the media, groups like the NRA or environmental groups on the left or
Planned Parenthood, right?
Planned Parenthood,
right. So the NRA and Planned Parenthood probably do more voter education and mobilization
than the parties.
Than the parties themselves do, certainly in certain states, right?
Yeah.
And so all of these party functions, opposition research, issue development, all of these things, they're now run by outside institutions. And the problem is that Madison understood that, he came around on parties. He originally didn't like them, but he understood that what they actually did was they forced different members of coalitions that generally saw things the same way, to compromise a little in order to have the whole coalition win. When the coalition breaks up and each constituent member is only invested really in their own portfolio, it is an inducement to get more and more extreme. So Planned Parenthood, whatever you think about abortion, their positions have become more extreme as a historical matter. The NRA, ditto. Lots of institutions. And so when you have that phenomenon, the ability for the parties to impose compromise, to weed out extremists, to weed out demagogues becomes much rougher. And so you have, in 2016, you had a guy who wasn't a Republican for most of his life, hijacked the Republican Party. You had a guy who wasn't a Democrat for most of his life.
Socialist, yeah.
Almost hijacked the Democratic Party. And he actually is turning out, I think, in retrospect, to have been the Barry Goldwater of the American left, because Goldwater famously lost in '64, but he completely changed the Republican Party. Sanders seems to be doing the same thing. And so when you add into that the role of negative partisanship, where, basically it's just the idea that there are millions of people who call themselves Democrats because they hate Republicans, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And in that climate, it is very difficult for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party to impose any discipline on voters because they're the ones who have the keys to the kingdom. And so what we're trying to do with the Dispatch, which is going to be a full-fledged publishing thing, right now we're just starting
Empire, I think.
Empire is the way we're looking at it.
Yeah.
I'm particularly looking for the Center for Journalism on the Aegean, which is like year 3. But
could I be a fellow? That I'd like to volunteer.
We'll talk. And no, but what we're conservatives. We do not apologize for being conservative. We have collectively between us, 75, 80 years of living in the world. I was at National Review for 21 years. Love National Review, but part of our model is sort of like the New Republic of the 1980s, in the early 1990s. You knew those guys were liberal, but they weren't afraid to call BS on their own side. There's very little of that on the right these days. Certainly in the sort of in the scrum of political coverage, there's very little of it. You do have all sorts of good public. I like a lot of what National Review does, but they don't do a lot of reporting. Commentary, national affairs, there are lots of good eggheady magazines that don't do any reporting at all. And what we want to do is reporting and analysis that's not clickbaity, that's not geared towards monetizing dopamine hits, where basically what you're doing is you're screaming at people, this should enrage you, so click here for more. We want to slow things down. We want to be honest. We don't want to carry water for a party. We don't want to do what my friend David French calls nut picking, where you take the most extreme version of somebody on the other side, say an Ilhan Omar, and you hold them up and say, see, this is what they all are like, right?
Like that, yeah.
And the Democrats and the mainstream media do that to Republicans too. And we're going to be, we want to be exciting and entertaining products and podcasts and newsletters and articles, but we don't want to be afraid to say the other side has a point, or that our own side is BSing you or gaslighting you.
Right. I know you've got a speech on campus tonight. That's why you're up here in Poughkeepsie. Yep. So thanks for stopping by. I'm got to get you out the door to get to that. Real quick, the Dispatch is your new media empire. Mm-hmm. We're going to put all this in the show notes. The Remnant is still a podcast.
It is now a product of the Dispatch.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Zoe and Pippa for Dog Fans.
Sure.
And anything else that you're doing that
I'm a syndicated columnist. I write for the LA Times. I'm a Fox News contributor, though I'm not on Fox too much these days, as you might imagine.
Yeah. You're on the wrong side of that.
And I'm a fan of brown liquors and cigars, so there's that.
And the Nationals, is it your baseball, or is it just happening?
I'm very excited for the Nationals. I am not a bandwagon kind of guy. Yeah. I grew up in New York City, so I would feel a little cheap. But I hope they win. I mean, because who cares about the Astros?
Well, also, it's always good to have a first-time kind of thing. I think in any sports, you rally behind that, or really long time, like the Cubs, when they finally won. That was who didn't root for them.
And my friend and former Fox colleague before he passed away, Charles Krauthammer, who was very dear to me, he loved the Nationals so much. So sort of for him, I'm definitely rooting for the Nationals.
There you go. Well, we'll cross our fingers and hope it works out. Thank you so much for stopping by. Really appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I want to thank Jay and Jonah. And of course, baseball is in the air in Washington. And from Washington, we have a good friend, formerly of Knight Ridder, McClatchy, and now executive director of the White House Correspondents Association, Steve Thoma. Steve, back in Marist and here for the podcast, and then a seminar with our students later this evening. So thank you, Steve, for schlepping up to Marist.
Never a schlep, always glad to be here. And I'm sorry that baseball's not in the air in New York as much as it is in Washington. I'm not really sorry at all.
Yeah, well, you're a Chicago fan, so you get
Chicago
to watch.
and Washington.
Yeah, so sorry.
Yeah, you get to watch, as a White Sox fan growing up, I think you get to watch a lot of October baseball without actually participating.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Thanks. Thanks
There's
for
an
that.
old joke about a Yankee Stadium. We're going to get to the program in a minute, but what's the difference between Yankee Stadium hot dogs and Fenway Park hot dogs? You can eat Yankee Stadium hot dogs in October. That's going to help.
But you're not eating them now,
No,
so
I'm eating crow is what I'm eating. Anyway, Steve, let's talk White House Correspondents Association. Tell us about your role. It's been in the news periodically, sometimes a lot in the news, sometimes not as much. Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. The White House Correspondents Association is about 105 years old, created in 1914 to represent the White House press corps, reporters, now cameramen, sound, everyone who covers the White House for a news organization. We represent them. We negotiate their access. To make sure the reporters have a chance to question the president or the White House staff. We take care of logistics, from who's going to be in the van and the motorcade to who's on Air Force One to what hotel are we going to stay at in London when the president goes there, or Paris. We basically take care of all their needs. They take care of the journalism. We take care of the journalists.
And so when we see a group of people on the driveway outside the White House talking to President Trump, those are people who are members of your association,
Right.
or their organizations are.
Right. We have about 120 news organizations represented in our association, and about 400 regular working journalists who cover the White House every day are our members.
And I read somewhere, and I could be wrong, it's possible, this could be under fake news, let me try it out, that it was founded originally during President Wilson because there was a break in trust between the press corps and the White House. Is there any truth to that, or am I making that up?
It was more a turf battle with Congress. What had happened was Woodrow Wilson decided to start having regular press conferences, which were not a thing. There had been only reporters really on the White House grounds for about 20, 25 years at that point, in and out, not a regular feature. And Wilson decided to have press conferences, and the congressional press decided, the Standing Committee of Correspondents in Congress said, we'll pick which reporters get to go cover the White House. And the White House reporters said, no way. This is our turf. So they created this association and said, we'll take care of ourselves. Thank you very much.
So 105 years is a long time. How has, historically, not necessarily just in the last few years, but historically, how has the relationship between the White House and the press changed in your eyes?
Well, it's always adversarial. We're in a particularly charged moment now with President Trump and the White House press. But as Ron Chernow, historian, pointed out at our annual dinner last year, this goes back to Washington, Adams, Jefferson, sometimes much more vitriolic, the fights with the press who covered the president. So it's periodic. It's always adversarial. It's always challenging, sometimes not as challenging as others. But we've had periods of high tension before.
What about the coverage itself? How has that changed in terms of what makes news?
Well, a couple things have changed. Technology has made it easier and even economically advantageous to send out quick, short bursts of news or information as short as a Twitter tweet of a couple hundred characters, and things that wouldn't have been news 10 years ago, 50 years ago. And that sometimes those become not front page news in what we used to think in the traditional sense. They're not statements of war and peace. They're literally, what the sunset looked like on the lawn as the president left. There's a lot more information, not necessarily a lot more news. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you've also talked about I know in class and your previous visits to Maris about the whole photo taking side of the White House coverage of the president. So that is also something that has been somewhat of a struggle, I guess, historically, because of the desire for journalists to have their own photos, the White House to have their own selection of what they want to have sent out.
And probably with technology, even more so now. I mean, how do we even know a photo is a photo if we're not trusting the source of who took it?
Well, I'll get to a commercial. I'll have a WHCA and White House press corps commercial about that in a second. But the ability of the White House, any president and his staff, to put out their own photos, their own video, their own text, has changed only in the last 10, 12 years. A John Kennedy, a Lyndon Johnson, even a Ronald Reagan could only imagine what they would have had they been able to release their own things straight to the people. The White House has Flickr and Twitter and Facebook and a YouTube channel of its own and a web page. They don't have to go through CBS or the New York Times or the Associated Press. They can release it directly. No one had that till 15 years ago.
So if the goal in the White House is to manage the news and manage the coverage, because that makes sense from their perspective, you're trying to maintain some independent filter, if you will, or an independent voice representing the public. Is that the role?
Yeah, I mean, our role is to make sure these 120 news organizations can cover the White House. And I mean, that's absolutely critical. I mean, they put our job in the Constitution. Not every job is in the Constitution, but our country, for a long time alone in the world, thought this was a critical part of self-governing, that we are able to question the government. And the government, its most important, is the president. Now, about the commercial, Barb had raised the question of how can you trust a photo in this age of Photoshop and the ability to doctor photos. That's a very important thing. And that's why, for example, in Ronald Reagan's presidency, when he had been shot and there was concern over his health, he was still in the hospital at George Washington University Hospital, and the White House released a photo of him standing in his hotel room to show him he could stand up.
Hospital room? You mean hospital room?
Hospital room.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
He was wearing a bathrobe, and you could see that. What they cropped out, because the White House took the picture and the White House released it, they cropped out of the photo all the IV bags standing right next to him. You could see it 1, 2, but you couldn't see how many he was hooked up to. A journalist would have shown you the whole picture of what was in the room.
Was that for national security reasons? We hear that as a excuse or a rationale many times for the White House controlling what comes out of the White House in terms of news. How do you balance that?
Well, there have been cases for the last 50, 80 years where administrations, presidents have asked individual outlets to hold back on reporting. President Kennedy asked the New York Times to hold back on reporting on the Bay of Pigs, and they agreed to not report on it. There are things that people have held back because they've been convinced that, yes, that would be a risk, if not to American soldiers, but to American interests, to release that now. And there are conversations that happen between a U.S. government and a media outlet, not the whole press corps. If the whole press corps knows, then everybody knows. But an individual outlet, a network, a website, that happens. But in terms of a picture, I can't imagine that would be national security.
Steve, I wouldn't let you go without asking about safety of journalists.
Yeah.
We know that there's been a rise in the fierceness of the rhetoric in the world, really. In many instances, we've, of course, have seen instances recently where journalists have died while on the job. And there are some who are in captivity, with the White House Correspondents Association trying to put publicity to that fact. Could you talk a little bit about the safety and how that has become a concern in the current climate that we live in?
I have to say, I wouldn't compare the safety of journalists covering a campaign rally in Iowa with the safety of journalists in a civil war in Syria. That's where people are actually killed or taken hostage. A former colleague at McClatchy, Austin Tice, has been held for many years. So that's not the same. Now, I also don't want to minimize how reporters feel when they go out. This is particularly true in campaign rallies. This is not at the White House. There's nothing like that there. But people coming up to where the press is working in the middle of a rally on the floor and sometimes spitting on people, that's happened, and screaming obscenities. And I think some journalists have felt insecure in that environment. Yeah.
You've covered the campaigns as a journalist, for many cycles. Do you feel that intensity has changed?
A little bit, but the reality is, it's been there for quite a while. The news media is not the most trusted institution in the United States, and that didn't start 2.5 years ago, and particularly from the right. And I remember being at it might have been a Mitt Romney rally in 2012, and a guy had one of these standard posters that said "Annoy the media" or "Don't trust them. Don't trust the liberal media." And I went over and asked him, "Can I get one of those for my office?" And at first he was very hostile. I mean, he started, "You're a traitor," but I just engaged in conversation with him, and I still have that poster for my office. It's put out by an interest group, but that attitude has been there for some time.
Yeah. Well, we hope.
I think one thing that's changed is social media allows people, when you don't have to be in the room, for them to vent these threats. And that is not unique to the campaign.
And Steve, I should point out, we're going to talk about it in class tonight, that the White House Correspondents Association does so much more than even what we've talked about today in terms of scholarships and helping future journalists to get into the career, and that's such important work. And we should also point out that we're not only very happy to have you here at Marist, but you're in this podcast speaking as a political journalist, not as the executive director of the White House Correspondents Association. Just in case there's any confusion about that, your opinions, what they say, are yours, not necessarily those of the association. But thank you so much for coming up. We really, really do appreciate it.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I do not speak for the association. I speak for my own experience.
Great.
That will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Thank you to Mary Griffith, our executive producer, as always, doing a wonderful job.
And we'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Roper Center Archives at Cornell University, who provide us with the ability to look back in time at trend data, at survey questions, the results. It helps enlighten what we're talking about, particularly when we have to look back at things over the past decades.
And we love to hear from you. Questions about questions about polls in general, maybe questions you'd like us to ask on polls. And the best way to contact us is through social media. We're at Marist Poll Facebook, and we're in Instagram, and we're in Twitter, and all those various places. So reach out to us that way. And don't forget to look down at the device on which you are listening to this podcast on and hit subscribe. We'll see you next time.